In 1896, archaeologist George Pepper and excavation foreman Richard Wetherill entered Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, northwestern New Mexico, as part of the Hyde exploring expedition. What they were facing was not a village in any ordinary sense. Pueblo Bonito spread across more than 3 acres. Its curved sandstone walls had once risen 4 or 5 stories. Depending on how rooms are counted across different phases of excavation and reconstruction, the complex contained well over 600 rooms, along with dozens of ceremonial kivas. And almost immediately, the excavators began pulling objects from those rooms that made the canyon harder, not easier to understand. Turquoise by the thousands, tropical bird remains, unusual cylindrical vessels, elaborate burials, materials that had traveled enormous distances into one of the driest landscapes in the American Southwest. Yet when the archaeology was eventually placed against tree ring dates, settlement surveys, and later genetic evidence, another puzzle emerged. This enormous center did not end in one catastrophic night. There is no burned destruction layer showing a city suddenly annihilated, no single battlefield explaining the evacuation, no written account describing a final day. Instead, monumental construction slowed after roughly AD 1130 to 1150. Chaco's regional influence shifted elsewhere, and the canyon gradually lost the role it had held for generations. The dramatic question is therefore not, where did everyone disappear to? We now know that Pueblo peoples survived, migrated, reorganized, and have living descendants. The harder question is this: what happened to the system powerful enough to build Chaco in the first place? Chaco Canyon sits within the San Juan Basin, an austere landscape where farming depends on understanding water, soil, season, and risk. Between roughly AD 850 and 1250, ancestral Pueblo communities turned this canyon and the surrounding region into something without a close North American parallel. Monumental great houses rose from carefully shaped sandstone. More than 150 great houses across the wider region were linked culturally to the Chaco system, and engineered roads extended outward through the desert. Pueblo Bonito alone became one of the largest buildings constructed in what is now the United States before the 19th century. UNESCO describes Chaco as a major ceremonial, trade, and political center for the prehistoric Four Corners region. But even that language leaves a problem. Was Chaco a capital, a pilgrimage center, a ritual landscape, a redistribution system, a home of powerful families, or some combination of all of them? Archaeologists still debate how many people actually lived permanently inside the monumental complexes. The canyon is incredibly visible in stone, yet strangely difficult to reconstruct in human terms. Quick second before we go deeper. If you enjoy investigations where the evidence is real but the answer is still open, subscribe. It costs you 1 click, and it helps me keep digging into places like this without turning unanswered questions into fantasy. Now, back to Chaco, because the first discovery changes the entire idea of a vanished city. The first discovery. This may never have been a normal city. When Pepper and Wetherill began excavating Pueblo Bonito in 1896, they were entering a structure so large that early observers naturally treated it as the remains of a densely inhabited settlement. Imagine walking through room after room beneath walls that had once towered several stories above you. Hundreds of enclosed spaces, massive plazas, kivas sunk into the ground. If you encountered a building of that scale today, you would assume a huge residential population. But decades of excavation complicated that picture. Archaeologists found that Chaco's great houses did not always produce the kinds of ordinary domestic traces expected from hundreds or thousands of people continuously cooking, sleeping, raising children, and discarding waste in every room. The National Park Service now explicitly notes that great houses may not have been traditional farming villages occupied by enormous permanent populations. Many could have functioned partly as public architecture, used cyclically for ceremony, exchange, gatherings, storage, or visiting groups. And that creates an eerie inversion. The mystery is not simply why a crowded city emptied, it is whether the immense buildings were ever crowded in the way the word city makes us imagine. Chaco drew labor and materials from a vast region, yet the monumental core may have housed far fewer permanent residents than its architecture suggests. Researchers continue debating the canyon's population and the social function of its great houses. No surviving Chacoan text explains who was allowed into which rooms, who controlled the stored goods, or why generations invested so much labor in buildings that may have stood partly empty between large gatherings. You can still walk beside those walls today. They are physically enormous. The human footprint inside them is much harder to see. So, if Pueblo Bonito was not simply an apartment block for a dense urban population, what exactly was all that architecture for? The second discovery. The forest came from somewhere else. As excavators exposed roofs and interior chambers, they found thousands upon thousands of wooden construction elements embedded in Chaco's masonry. The obvious problem was visible simply by looking around. Chaco Canyon does not contain forests capable of supplying the huge quantity of straight conifer beams required for the great houses. Researchers eventually estimated that the Chacoan monumental buildings incorporated more than 200,000 large timbers, with some studies placing the total above 240,000. In 2001, Nathan English and colleagues used strontium isotope ratios to investigate where some of those trees had grown. Later, Chris Gitterman and his team compared tree ring patterns from 170 timbers across 7 great houses. Their work showed that builders were drawing heavily on mountain forests far beyond the canyon, including the Chusca Mountains and the Mount Taylor region. After about AD 1020, roughly 70% of the sampled wood analyzed in the tree ring study was consistent with procurement from the Chuscas. Now imagine the physical act behind those numbers. A freshly cut ponderosa trunk is not a ceremonial trinket you slip into a pouch. These were structural beams transported across many miles of uneven high desert terrain without trucks and without draft animals carrying wagons. A 2023 experimental study examined whether people using tump lines could have transported large timbers, because the logistics remain one of the canyon's great practical questions. Researchers understand increasingly well where much of the wood originated. What remains far less certain is how the labor was organized on this scale, who coordinated it, whether crews moved beams along Chacoan roads, and what social obligation or belief convinced communities to repeat the process thousands of times. The mystery has shifted from where were the trees to something more human. Who could command that much labor, and why did people agree to provide it? The third discovery. The roads refuse to behave like roads. Archaeological surveys beyond the great houses revealed broad, deliberately engineered corridors extending across the desert landscape. The best documented is the Great North Road, beginning near Pueblo Alto above Chaco Canyon. Surveyors traced it northward toward Chaco Canyon, where one portion reaches the canyon edge and appears to stop abruptly. Other road alignments run toward outlying communities, while some survive only in disconnected segments. These were not narrow footpaths created accidentally by generations of people walking the easiest route. Chacoan roads could run extraordinarily straight, ignore convenient contours, cross difficult terrain, and use ramps, stairs, and engineered changes in elevation. Some segments were around 9 meters, or roughly 30 feet wide. That is what keeps archaeologists arguing about their purpose. Transport almost certainly occurred along at least some of them. Walking on a prepared surface would help when moving timber or goods. But purely practical roads normally adapt to terrain and connect places efficiently. Several Chacoan alignments seem to care about something else. Researchers have proposed ceremonial movement, pilgrimage, symbolic geography, connections to sacred landforms, transportation, communication, and combinations of these functions. The Great North Road alone extends across a landscape far larger than anyone would engineer casually. Its original meaning is still not definitively known. Stand at Pueblo Alto and imagine a 30-foot wide road leaving the architecture behind and heading almost arrow straight into open country. No sign tells you why it was built. No inscription names its destination. What kind of society spends that much labor building a road whose most important destination may not have been another town at all? The fourth discovery. One room contained a dynasty. During the early excavations of Pueblo Bonito, workers entered what became known as Room 33 in the northern portion of the Great House. What emerged was unlike an ordinary household burial. Human remains were associated with extraordinary concentrations of valuables, including vast quantities of turquoise ornaments. Later reassessment of the room identified the remains of numerous individuals, while the surrounding burial cluster became central to arguments that Chaco was not an egalitarian community. In 2017, researchers analyzed ancient DNA from individuals buried there and found that several shared the same mitochondrial lineage inherited through the maternal line. The genetic pattern was consistent with a matrilineal relationship extending across generations. The implications are unsettling because the architecture already hints at centralized organization. Now the burials suggest that at least one powerful lineage may have maintained elevated status for generations. But exactly what that status meant remains disputed. Were these hereditary rulers, ritual specialists, members of a prestigious ceremonial house? The DNA can identify biological relationships. It cannot tell us the title of the person buried with thousands of turquoise objects, or explain what authority that individual possessed while alive. And there is another important caution. Ancient DNA work on indigenous remains has generated serious ethical concerns, especially when descendant communities were not adequately consulted. Modern research increasingly emphasizes tribal leadership and indigenous control. So, Room 33 has given archaeology a family line, but not a constitution. If hereditary status existed at Chaco, what kind of political system was holding the canyon together? The fifth discovery. Tropical birds reached the desert. Early excavators at Pueblo Bonito uncovered the remains of scarlet macaws, birds whose natural range lies far to the south in tropical and subtropical regions. Picture opening a sealed room in a dusty New Mexico great house and finding the bones or feathers of an animal whose brilliant red body belonged hundreds of miles away. For decades, macaws were treated as evidence of Chaco's long-distance connections. Then researchers gained a better way to ask when those connections began. In 2015, Adam Watson and colleagues directly radiocarbon dated scarlet macaw remains from Chaco Canyon. Some dated to approximately AD 900 to 975, pushing procurement of these tropical birds earlier than many models had expected. Later, archaeogenomic work analyzed ancient DNA from scarlet macaws recovered from Chaco and other southwestern sites, trying to understand breeding and exchange patterns. But the human system that moved the birds north is still only partially visible. Macaws are not sacks of corn. They are living animals, requiring food, protection, and care over long journeys. Their feathers, color, rarity, and behavior likely gave them extraordinary social meaning. But we do not possess a Chacoan written explanation. Researchers can trace dates and genetics. They cannot reconstruct every hand through which a living macaw passed. Think about the chain required to bring even one bird alive into Chaco Canyon around 1,000 years ago. Then ask why a society in the high desert wanted tropical birds badly enough to maintain that connection. The sixth discovery. Chocolate left a chemical fingerprint. More than a century after Pueblo Bonito's excavation began, archaeologist Patricia Crown looked again at unusual ceramic vessels from the site, especially the tall cylindrical jars found in remarkable numbers there. In 2009, Crown and chemist Jeffrey Hurst tested residues preserved inside pottery sherds. Chemical analysis detected theobromine, a compound strongly associated in this context with cacao. Suddenly, objects excavated from the New Mexico desert were carrying molecular evidence of a plant that does not grow anywhere near Chaco. Cacao had traveled north through exchange networks ultimately connected to Mesoamerica. That result changed the scale of the mystery. Pueblo Bonito contained an exceptional concentration of cylinder jars. Room 28 alone yielded more than 100 examples during early excavation. Researchers now know that cacao-containing beverages were present in the pre-Hispanic Southwest, and later testing expanded evidence for ritual drinks beyond one vessel type. But chemistry cannot tell us who was allowed to drink them. Were cacao beverages restricted to elites, shared during large ceremonies, consumed by visitors arriving along those broad roads? The ingredients traveled astonishing distances, while the rules surrounding their use vanished from the archaeological record. No recipe, no guest list, no surviving written account of the ceremony. Tell me in the comments if you found tropical birds, exotic drinks, turquoise wealth, and monumental ritual spaces concentrated in one desert center. Would you call it a city, a temple complex, a political capital, or something that does not fit any of those categories? The seventh discovery. The sunlight was being measured. In the summer of 1977, researcher Anna Sofer climbed onto Fajada Butte and documented an extraordinary interaction between carved spirals and slabs of sandstone. At particular times of year, sunlight passing between the slabs formed narrow patterns across the petroglyphs. The feature became known as the sun dagger. Subsequent observation linked its changing light and shadow patterns to the solar calendar, including solstices and equinoxes. Chacoan architecture elsewhere also shows astronomical orientations, and researchers have investigated possible relationships to the long lunar standstill cycle. But there is a painful twist. The original light pattern no longer falls exactly as it did when researchers first documented it, because the sandstone slabs shifted, with erosion and foot traffic contributing to the instability. The area is now closed to ordinary public access. The larger question survives: how extensive was Chacoan astronomical knowledge, and what role did celestial observation play in political or ceremonial authority? Tracking a solstice is one thing. Coordinating architecture and landscape over generations is another. The builders left alignments, but no written astronomical manual. Modern researchers can calculate what the sun does. They cannot simply calculate what the sun meant. If controlling sacred time gave certain people authority over planting dates, ceremonies, or regional gatherings, was astronomy one of the invisible mechanisms that held Chaco together? The eighth discovery. The sky may be carved into the rock. Along the Peñasco Blanco Trail, researchers have studied a pictograph showing a crescent-like form, a star-shaped image, and a hand. One interpretation connects it to the spectacular supernova recorded by observers elsewhere in the world in AD 1054, the explosion whose remnant we now know as the Crab Nebula. The National Park Service treats that interpretation cautiously. The panel may depict the event, but certainty is impossible. Another Chaco petroglyph has been proposed as a representation of the total solar eclipse of July 11, 1097. Again, May is the critical word. This is where archaeology reaches a hard limit. Modern astronomers can reconstruct the sky over Chaco with extraordinary precision. They know when the supernova became visible. They can calculate eclipses backward through time. What they cannot do is interview the person who placed pigment on that rock. Similar shapes can carry meanings that have nothing to do with Western astronomical diagrams, and Pueblo cultural knowledge cannot simply be reduced to a modern sky chart. So researchers stand between a perfect celestial event and an ambiguous human image. The dates can match, the sky can match, the intention remains unprovable. Imagine witnessing a star bright enough to be seen in daylight and living in a society already intensely attentive to the heavens. Would you record it? And if this panel is that record, what did Chaco's people believe they were witnessing? The ninth discovery. The climate turned against the system. The breakthrough came through wood itself. Tree ring research in the southwest allowed scientists to convert ancient timbers into year-by-year climate records. Chaco's beams, preserved inside masonry, became chronological evidence as well as architecture. Studies of the regional system identify a major drought beginning around AD 1130 and continuing, with variation, through much of the 12th century. That timing overlaps disturbingly well with the slowdown of major construction and the transformation of Chaco's regional role. The start dates line up closely enough that drought has become impossible to ignore in any explanation of Chaco's decline. But drought is not the same thing as an answer. People in the southwest had survived dry periods before. Farming communities possessed generations of environmental knowledge. Researchers have therefore proposed combinations of drought, resource pressure, declining agricultural reliability, political disruption, changing exchange networks, and shifts in religious or social organization. Nature's 2025 genomic study summarizes the cause of Chaco's depopulation after about 1150 as still debated. That phrase matters. Science has identified a severe environmental stressor. It has not identified a single switch that turned Chaco off. No one can point to one tree ring and say, on this day, the decision was made to leave. Climate squeezed the system. Human beings decided what happened next. Why did they choose reorganization rather than rebuilding the old center? The 10th discovery. The vanishing happened in stages. As archaeologists expanded their view beyond Chaco Canyon itself, they found that the story after Chaco was not emptiness. Architectural influence and population shifted to other centers, including Aztec ruins to the north and communities across the wider Pueblo world. The National Park Service describes change during the 1100s and 1200s, not a single overnight disappearance. Monumental construction in the canyons slowed, while traditions and communities persisted elsewhere. By around AD 1300, major population movement had reshaped much of the northern southwest, with ancestral Pueblo peoples moving toward areas including the Rio Grande Valley, Zuni, and the Hopi Mesas. That means absence itself becomes evidence. There is no last king's inscription, no final Chacoan census, no document saying who departed first, no single mass grave of a population exterminated in one event. Instead, archaeologists have thousands of individual decisions fossilized into changing settlement patterns. Families moved, communities consolidated, ceremonial systems changed, new centers grew, while old ones lost importance. Scientists can map that movement much better than they can explain the motives behind each stage, and the slow character of the transformation may be more unsettling than a dramatic catastrophe. A city destroyed in a day gives you a cause to search for. A system abandoned over generations forces you to ask when ordinary people stopped believing the old center was worth maintaining. At what point did Chaco stop feeling permanent? The 11th discovery. The people never vanished. In April 2025, a study led in collaboration with the sovereign nation of Pueblo Pueblo added a new and unusually powerful line of evidence. Researchers analyzed genomes from 16 ancient individuals associated with Pueblos and 13 present-day Pueblo members, then compared them with other ancient and modern indigenous genomes, including previously published data from Pueblo Bonito. The project was initiated with Pueblo involvement and control, a major difference from older approaches to indigenous genetic research. The results showed strong genetic continuity between ancient and present-day Pueblos and a close relationship to the sampled ancestral individuals from Pueblo Bonito, approximately 275 kilometers away. One present-day Pueblo individual even carried the same rare mitochondrial haplotype, B2Y1, found in the Pueblo Bonito room 33 individuals. And here is the discovery that overturns the title of this entire mystery. The genetic analysis found no evidence for a pre-European population collapse among the Pueblo lineage. Chaco's monumental political and ceremonial system declined, but people continued. Oral histories had preserved relationships that archaeology was sometimes too willing to frame as disappearance. The researchers are careful about what the data cannot show. DNA sampling among Pueblo communities remains extremely limited, and no single modern community can be treated as the exclusive descendant of Chaco. Multiple Pueblo nations maintain ancestral relationships with the canyon. Science has therefore solved one mystery only by sharpening another. The people did not evaporate. They transformed, migrated, joined other communities, preserved traditions, and carried ancestry forward. So the disappearance we see in Chaco is not the disappearance of a population. It is the disappearance of a particular social order. And that may be the most important thing Chaco Canyon can teach us. We are drawn to abandoned places because stone gives us the illusion that societies are solid. Pueblo Bonito still stands in the desert. The roads are still faintly visible. Timber beams still contain annual rings laid down almost 1,000 years ago. Chemical residues of cacao still survive inside pottery. Macaw bones still carry DNA. The spirals on Fajada Butte still wait for the moving sun, even though the slabs around them have shifted. Chaco feels permanent, precisely because so much of it remains. But the system behind those things was never made of sandstone. It was made of agreements between people, agreements about labor, ceremony, authority, exchange, sacred places, food, leadership, and where the center of their world should be. Those agreements could change. By about AD 1150, the great construction campaigns were fading. Environmental pressure was intensifying. Regional relationships were changing. Eventually, communities invested their futures somewhere else. But they did not walk out of history. Their descendants are part of living Pueblo nations, whose connections to these landscapes survived long after archaeologists began calling the ruins abandoned. That is why vanished civilization is the wrong ending. Chaco Canyon is not a story about a people who mysteriously disappeared. It is a story about a powerful system that stopped being reproduced. And perhaps that is harder to explain. We can identify the distant mountains where the roof beams grew. We can detect cacao molecules invisible to the naked eye. We can sequence DNA from 1,000 years ago. We can reconstruct an eclipse to the minute. We can date drought from the width of a tree ring. Yet we still cannot recover the conversations in which families decided they would not return, the ceremonies that changed meaning, or the moment when a road leading toward Chaco no longer felt like a road leading toward the center of the world. So when you stand among Pueblo Bonito's walls today, the question is no longer, where did everybody go? The real question is, what could make generations of people build one of the most extraordinary places in ancient North America, and then decide that their future belonged somewhere else? If that question stays with you, share this investigation with someone who still thinks Chaco Canyon simply vanished overnight.